Well, thank you all for being here in person and online. Thank you for having me. It is an honor. Yeah, could we go ahead and cut the lights off? It'll look better, I think. All right. So yeah, Rebecca introduced me. My name is Stephen Davies. The name of the talk I'll be giving tonight is From the Backyard to the Basement, the Biology Lab, kind of encompassing a variety of experiences that I have had and want to talk about tonight. It was working. All right, I'll use this. All right, so a little bit about me. As noted, I grew up loving reptiles and amphibians. I grew up in Boy Scouts. I had a pet red-eared slider for a long time. Before that, I had a pet diamondback terrapin when I was young. So when I was a child, going to the zoo and the aquarium were some of my favorite things to do. After leaving, whenever someone asked what my favorite animal was, it would always be followed by besides the reptiles. I went to nature camps at Oregon Ridge. There was a time where I was around 10 years old, and up at the beginning of the Gwynns Falls, me and some of my neighbors found snapping turtles laying eggs on the rocks next to the train tracks above a creek. And I consider that a foundational moment in my love of reptiles. These days, I like hiking and foraging. And I went back to school a little bit later in life, and in 2022 earned a bachelor's in biology at Towson and then a master's in 2023. After that, I worked at the DNR in the Park Service for 2 seasons. And I do hold the strong belief that both conservationists and hobbyists are important to the longevity of reptiles and amphibians. I'm not afraid to hide that I have some ambivalence. I have some strong opinions about this topic, but I think a lot of other people do as well. So, what are reptiles and amphibians? They're actually pretty distantly related, but a lot of times they take up similar roles in the environment. Herpetology is the scientific study of reptiles and amphibians. Anyone who's here is probably pretty familiar. Reptiles have scales, amphibians have a larval stage. Amphibians are kind of more closely related to fish, and reptiles are a little bit more towards birds. They're both vertebrates, they're both cold-blooded, or not really cold-blooded, but ectothermic. And why should we care about them? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Does anyone here want to give any reasons they think why?
They're adorable.
They're adorable is a great answer.
Most offspring of reptiles and amphibians are a biomass of food for everything else on the planet. Basically, very few ever of the clutches, or whether it's a amphibian frog, whatever, they hardly any of them come up to be an adult. They're really eaten. So that's valuable.
Like 1 million tadpoles in my pond right now.
Right.
And they'll get like 3 frogs.
And you'll
Yeah.
get a dozen frogs out of it.
With wood frogs, it's crazy seeing that in the spring.
See this person.
So yeah, those were all things in my notes. They're part of the ecosystem. They are predators and prey. They eat bugs and rodents and other things, and they get eaten by everything.
Yep.
And especially when they're babies. Caring about them helps care about the places that they come from, whether it's native or it's overseas, anywhere in between. Caring about the places that they're from and wanting to protect them is really important, even if you don't like reptiles. And people have them as pets. For people that are allergic to cats and dogs, more traditional pets, reptiles can be great, and they help modern medicine. Right now, there are studies going on where ophthalmologists are studying the eyes of geckos to learn about the way human eyes works, because there's a lot of similarities. The drug Ozempic is created after studying Gila monster venom. And seed dispersal, as Katrina mentioned earlier.
Some studying with like axolotl studying how they generate their living.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, so a lot of ways we can learn from them. And then kind of what you said, Matt, why should we care? Because they're awesome. I mean, if you see these animals in the wild or in captivity, how could you not think that? The top left is the harlequin toad. The Baltimore Zoo is working on breeding them in captivity and repopulating the areas that they're functionally extinct in Panama. On the top right, it's a northern emerald tree boa, and the bottom is a Gila monster, which are some of my favorite herps. So some threats to wildlife. Habitat destruction and fragmentation. This is the biggest one as far as I know. Right now, 41% of amphibian species are endangered, 21% of reptile species are endangered, and over 50% of turtle species are endangered. And with forest fires being an increasing threat and deforestation for logging and agriculture, last year, an area the size of Panama was taken out of the tropical rainforest. And that's the most that's happened in the last 2 decades in a single year. And then parasites and pathogens. So earlier, we briefly mentioned chytrid fungus. Chytrid has been in the US for a long time. It's been found in museum specimens, but that's actually what's wiping out the harlequin toads in Panama. And then that's BD, one of the species of chytrid, but there's B. sal, which is decimating salamanders in Europe and Asia. It's not yet in the US, but it's not a matter of if it's going to get here, it's a matter of when. And right now in Maryland, we're seeing issues with ophidiomyces, the snake fungal disease, negatively impacting the eastern rat snakes and Nerodia, the water snakes. And then when we think of, like, this ties into the next point, invasive species. A lot of people know about Burmese pythons in Florida and in the Everglades, and people always think about the overconsumption of the native stuff. When you think about how they're negatively affecting the animals in the reptiles and amphibians in the Everglades, people might think they might eat them, or it might be that they are out competing for food sources. But one of the big things going on is the pentastome, which is actually a parasitic crustacean. People call it a tongue worm because it kind of looks like a tongue, but it's native to Southeast Asia, where the Burmese python is from, and it'll grow large. The Burmese python has a big enough body that it can live with it, but the dusky pygmy rattlesnakes, it especially impacts snakes that eat fish and snakes that eat amphibians. But garter snakes, water snakes, things like that are really negatively being affected and wiped out by this pentastome that Burmese pythons have brought over. And then one of the biggest ones is actually cats. A lot of people don't realize how damaging house cats are. Does anyone have a guess in the US alone how many reptiles are killed by house cats?
I know birds spend over.
Birds is bad too.
Over a billion.
Yeah. So there's a wide range, but the median estimate is about 473 million per year. Reptiles are killed by house cats.
Wow.
And it's about 173 million amphibians. So, it's been proven that the trap and release doesn't work. It doesn't matter if you feed the cat, they will still continue to kill things. I love cats, but I just keep them indoors. And then they won't get killed by cars. But touching on roadkill, that's a big issue as well. If you live around here, or especially like closer to a body of water, this month June especially, you'll see them on the side of the road. You'll see turtles especially. I see black rat snakes. It's really sad. I'll stop and move things. If you are going to move something, don't pick up a turtle by the tail. Make sure to put it in the direction it's going. go 10, 30 feet's better off the road, but it's a big problem. And places with warmer climates, with larger populations, even more are gonna get taken out. One more issue is poaching. And this could be for the pet trade is obviously the biggest one and the one that receives the most attention. My personal opinion is that it's kind of conflated the negative impact that that has on these wild populations compared to what habitat destruction is doing to them. But I can't deny that this does happen. And this here is a picture of a garter snake. I took it at Gunpowder Falls State Park, and after seeing it, we scared it off the path because it was a well-traveled path near a swimming spot, and we thought someone might kill it if we left it there. So who cares? Who cares about reptiles? A lot of people. Scientists, conservationists, breeders, hobbyists, researchers, doctors, fishermen, hunters, academics, zookeepers, teachers, professors, veterinarians, park rangers, citizen scientists, bird watchers, hikers, and students, just to name a few.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
But also, who cares about it? You, if you're here, and me. This is a picture of a small, a baby Decay's brown snake that I found. It's one of the smallest snakes I've ever seen. I've seen other kinds of snakes right out of the egg, but most people would have thought that was a worm, but I had the sight for it. I just wanted to share it because I thought it was cool. So really diving into the meat of this topic, I'm gonna address the two kind of different groups as I see them. And they largely overlap. I consider myself someone who has a foot in both of these camps. I think a lot of people here do. I think a lot of people I'm gonna describe like don't necessarily fit into one box or the other, but I do see that there is different sides of the Venn diagram that really could be brought together a little more. So by definition, a hobbyist is a person who engages in this pursuit, this activity for pleasure, and it's not their main occupation. Some breeders do this full time or import or whatever, but most do not. Most people who do it are either have another job or they, freelance stuff or they're retired. So some of the strengths that hobbyists bring to the table. They help people to not be afraid of the animals. I'm not a fan of someone shoving a giant reticulated python in someone's face walking down the street at like a carnival or something, but if someone has a pet snake and you get to hold it and see it, chances are you're not going to be afraid of it. And then if your neighbor goes to kill a snake with a shovel, you're more likely to stop them. And then some of them, like this boa that I have, that's from my personal collection. I brought a picture of it there. Like, they're gorgeous. There's no way that like you would find something exactly like that in the wild, but to see like such colorful and high contrast animals really is amazing. And in captivity, it allows people to observe their behavior. The behaviors might be a little bit different than they are in the wild, but you can still take note of whether they're more active at night, in the day. Like, are they cruising around the cage often? Do they climb? Do they tolerate handling? And how does this change over time? How does this change like from the time that they're young or to older? Because a lot of snakes really do exhibit different behaviors at different stages in their life. And next to that, you can see like ontogenic color changes. A lot of snakes, a lot of my favorite ones, I like green tree pythons. They start off either yellow or red and turn green. And that's not something you're going to be able to see if, you see one time in Indonesia or something like that. And then hobbyists also have figured out a lot about breeding. Speaking of boa constrictors, we know that 120 days after ovulating is when they'll drop their litter. they almost always drop on rainy days, or 105 days almost to a T after their post-ovulation shed. Those kinds of things, it would be possible to measure like with a small population in the wild, but unlikely and difficult. But it's something that we have been able to figure out from observing them in captivity. And incubation is a big part of that as well. You're able to hatch out animals at a higher rate. As we've said several times already, they're food for everything. If they're not eaten in the first, few weeks or year of their lives, they can generally live a long time. And in captivity, they can live much longer without the threat of predators, and with constant access to food, and not being subject to droughts and floods and things like that. And a lot of hobbyists have a broad knowledge of species. If you are to walk into a biology lab and show someone a picture of a Burmese python and an African rock python and ask them which is which, chances are they're not going to know. Some people might, but the biologists have a lot to share with us too. But that's just one example where I think the hobbyists could, afford to teach us something. Like, to be able to look at a carpet python and know what island it came from is not something that anybody I went to school with could do. But if I'm walking around a reptile show, at least a handful of people could do. But there are some weaknesses. And one of those is that knowledge can be limited to exotic species. People might know everything there is to know about breeding reticulated pythons after doing it for 30 years, but be unfamiliar with a coal skink or a hellbender or a bog turtle. Like, I've literally talked to people at expos who live in this region that have never heard of a bog turtle. And it's kind of like, well, they're possibly the most threatened reptile in North America. And I think, they're worth learning about in the world. Yeah. And sometimes, like, this natural history can be short-sighted. One of the things that I run into relatively frequently is people think desert equals hot and dry, but microclimates exist where, a lot of desert reptiles, and definitely desert amphibians, live underground. They live in the cooler and the more humid places in deserts. When people find out that an animal lives, in Indonesia or in Africa, people think, oh, it has to be hot. But there's elevation, there's mountains. It's not like a one size fits all. And that's something that I think a lot of hobbyists need to kind of, take an extra step to learn about more, especially with diet. Like, not every snake can eat rodents. And let's call it like it is. Some people are money oriented, and there's a variety of ways that this can negatively impact the hobby and conservation efforts. Like poaching, I mentioned earlier, but even legal collections, I think, can be unnecessary. Ball pythons are still imported 10,000 at a time. Go to any reptile show, that's all that's on the tables. Not all, but I mean, it's literally probably 75, 80%. Unfortunately, still, yes. And, being money oriented can cause people to try to fit as many snakes as they can into subpar caging, just to be able to have as much as they can. It can cause people to take more than they're able to take care of. Like, I know where I'm at right now, I cannot take care of any more snakes than I have unless I get rid of some. But I have, a certain amount. There are people that are like big breeders that have 5,000 snakes. And they'll have employees, but sometimes I'm just not convinced that they're all getting the best care. It can also encourage people to power feed, and especially with boids and snakes with slower metabolisms, be really detrimental. A lot of times this is to try to prove out certain morphs. Like, a new morph is cutting edge and everybody wants it, and they're selling for $10,000 each, But if you wait, 6 years like you should, they're going to be $600, and you just invested, $30,000 in animals. And it's not always that extreme, but it's not very rare that it is that extreme. But overfeeding them causes physiological stress, and it's terrible for the animal. And then sometimes people will sell animals that they know are unhealthy. We know that, that kind of goes into my next point, but we know 10 to 15 years ago, there was a big issue with nidovirus, and people were selling carpet pythons and green tree pythons that were nido positive and not telling people. Now it's kind of the standard to test before sending an animal out and after receiving it. Right now with Western hognose, we're experiencing a breakout of cryptosporidium. A lot of big hobbyists, or a lot of big breeders and big names in the hobby are, getting it in their collections. Everyone's pointing the finger at each other, but people are definitely selling stuff that they know has cryptosporidium because they're more money oriented than they are about the more interested in the well-being of the animal. And then snake mites are obviously another one. Mites and ticks and stuff like that come in on imports, and imports are risky to get. They shouldn't be for everybody. Someone who's experienced and knows how to quarantine and will take care of it, that's one thing. But some people will go to a reptile show and think, oh, that's cool, and it's $60, and on that guy's table it's $450. And then the person will say, oh yeah, you'll be fine, and not know that it has pinworms and mites and things like that. And it's just something we really need to take more seriously, in my opinion. One of the other things about being money oriented, just to dial it back for a second, is breeding morphs that are deleterious. Like with ball python spiders, the big one, a lot of people know it's incomplete dominant. One copy of that gene causes a neurological issue due to a skull deformation where they will wobble and have trouble eating. It happens with scoria and boas, but we know that with certain things like boas are kind of my thing, so that's why I have examples about them. But like the super motley gene is lethal in leopard gecko or crested geckos. We know the super lily, the 2 copies of the lily white gene, or if you breed in bearded dragons, the 0 gene, visual to visual, the babies won't thrive. And sometimes with 1 copy of the gene, the animal will do well, like motley or jungle and boas. 1 copy seems to be fine, but 1 copy of the scoria gene will cause that wobble. 1 copy of it in spider ball pythons will as well. And it raises the question, is it ethical to breed something because you think it looks cool, even though that animal's going to have issues? And personally, I don't love it and I wouldn't do it, but people will say it's wrong and then still buy a pug. So I don't know. It's just something to think about.
An active market for these animals that have deformities.
Absolutely. Because, like, for example, spider and the ball pythons, I mean, they look cool. I'm not saying they don't look cool, but it'll cause like a pattern abnormality. No, it's legal. I mean, that's was part of the boom in ball pythons. Like I've heard people tell me like, so it's an incomplete dominant. So, if one of the parents carries a gene, approximately half of the babies will have it. And people were selling the babies for $6,000 each, like in the mid 2000s. Like people were paying off their houses with spider ball pythons. And it's less common now than it was, but it still is a thing.
They still breed them and still sell them.
Yeah.
100%.
And some things like a super motley boa would die really shortly, and that wouldn't, no one's probably going to sell that. It's very unlikely. But with a lot of the spider ball pythons, and then some stuff there is debate about, like the jungle gene in boas. Some people are saying that 2 copies of it is not deleterious. It was due to inbreeding depression, and it's not attributed to the gene itself. But with spider ball pythons, we know that it is. And then here's a picture of two hognose of mine breeding. They're healthy. I have eggs incubating, which I'm happy about. And then, so that was kind of a rundown of some positives and negatives about hobbyists. So to touch on conservationists, what I went through earlier, this also includes researchers, hikers, fishermen, citizen scientists, professors, doctors, veterinarians. And a conservationist just really means someone who advocates for the conservation and preservation of wildlife. And like I said, a lot of people are both, even a lot of people who, you know, don't spend a lot of time in the woods, don't know much about the native wildlife, still generally will have a fondness and want to support the, you know, support these causes. But some of the strengths of conservationists, they're able to observe the animals in the wild. Although at times it will be for a shorter duration, you can get a lot of data from that that's really valuable. What humidity was it seen at? What time of day? What was the temperature? Was it climbing? What was it eating? What was the body plan like? How thin or heavy was it? Was it, you know, in the case of amphibians, was it making a noise? Like, I mean, only the males would, but nevertheless, like, there's a lot that we can learn about that. If it was eating, what was it eating? And then the hard science. Like, there's so much here. I'm just going to touch on it a little bit, but, you know, being able to actually look at the DNA and mitochondrial DNA of two isolated populations that might be separated by an island or you know, on two separate islands or by a mountain range, and actually determine whether these are the same species or not is huge. And learning about the physiology of these snakes and the anatomy is extremely important too. There's so many pragmatic reasons that learning about this can benefit breeding them or keeping them alive in captivity, learning about their metabolism and things like that. Even an understanding of the genetics a little better can help the morph kind of hobbyist. But there's, like, you know, a lot of people in the hobby could tell you the difference between, or know that with snake venom, it's a lot of times either neurotoxic or hemotoxic, and the neurotoxic means brain, hemotoxic means blood. But to actually know how that cellularly affects the thing that the snake is biting is huge. Like, that's something that the average layman has no idea about. And taking it a step further, like, to be able to understand the reproductive physiology of it, you know, the fertilization and the, you know, the process of gestation and development, things like that are super important. And now we are seeing more and more, there's some laboratories that can test sheds for the sex of animals, which is, again, beneficial for venomous snakes where you don't want to probe them or pop them, but also can determine what morphs are in them. And while, like, the people who run these labs are, you know, kind of more doing it as a, you know, private companies that are benefiting hobbyists, this same technology is boundless for the ways that it can help wild populations. And then advocacy. So again, here there's a ton, like, emerging threats are a huge thing. Like, I mentioned bee sow coming into the US. That's something that a lot of people in the reptile hobby and amphibian hobby are not super familiar with. There are ways that researchers can advocate for the legality of things and like to protect areas for conservation or legality of pets that hobbyists don't have the same footing for, we can say. And related to that, kind of, or related to the previous point of observing animals in the wild, like not all animals can be kept in captivity, and then some that can are not. So like newts and salamanders, a lot of them can do well in captivity and are not particularly hard to take care of, but you don't see much of them besides like axolotls. But things like a bog turtle or a sea turtle or something like that can't really be kept in captivity. It's illegal and it's impractical, and only,
I'm sorry.
except there's 5 people, I'm told, or something like that, that can with bog turtles, but I don't know who they are. But you know, being able to observe them in the wild is huge.
Yes.
And then learning about nomenclature. I know some people will think it's pretentious or, you know, something similar to being pretentious when people will describe an animal using the scientific nomenclature, but it is huge. It is very important to be able to know. Like you could say something like a simple word and it could mean so many different types of animals, like a tree frog. And I don't know how many species of tree frogs there are, but there's a ton. And this does get dicey, which I'll address in a few minutes. But an example here is like with like boa constrictors, you hear people say like BCI and BCC for boa constrictor and parador. Well, I think it was 2016, Imperador, Sigma, and Constrictor were all elevated from subspecies to species. So a boa imperator that lives from southern Mexico to the west side of the Andes Mountains is a different species than the boa constrictor that lives on the east side of the Andes in South America. Previously, they were frequently hybridized. And a lot of these hybrids do fine in captivity and are healthy animals, but it's like a 6% difference in DNA. And if that doesn't sound like a lot, consider that humans are 2% different from chimpanzees. So some of the weaknesses of conservationists, a lot of times they specialize only in native animals. And in and of itself, that's not a weakness. I think that there's a lot of great aspects to that, but there are animals worldwide that need to be protected and taken care of. And if, you know, your specialty is just localized to either this region, or some people might, you know, have a specific interest with, you know, Chinese giant salamander or something like that, that's great. But I believe that the scope in academia is not wide enough to get people really excited about animals all over the world. And like I said, field biologists or other conservationists, people working with the DNR, et cetera, may see animals in the wild, but a lot of times it is briefly. If you talk to people who go on these like herping expeditions with a target species, people always go off about how they find what they're looking for on the last day. It always seems to be the last day when they were ready to call it quits. But even if, you know, say you go out for 7 days and you see 10 of these animals, you're seeing them for like 10 minutes or something. Like, I mean, maybe a few hours, but it's different than someone who has like 3 generations of animals that are 10 years old. And people can be a little bit idealistic about it, I believe, and unfamiliar with the animal husbandry. A lot of people that I've been around in those kinds of circles will be like afraid of a snake, but advocate for them like vocally. But I think it's important to kind of like get your hands on them and understand that like bigger is not always better when it comes to enclosures, especially regarding baby reptiles that don't want to feel extremely exposed. And the concepts of always, like feeding live because it's more natural and things like that. I mean, a lot of the conservationists aren't exactly going to agree with that, but I've experienced some of that, or just a little bit of praxis that's missing. And then there are conflicts of interest. This is what I was touching on regarding the nomenclature. Like what happened with eastern rat snakes is extremely frustrating to me. It used to be 3 different species, and now they're lumped into one species. And a week or 2 ago, I went down the rabbit hole of looking up these, trying to look up different articles about them and like this name change. And I found like 5 or 6 other peer-reviewed review articles about how that's not the correct way to name a species. And what that has done essentially is said that the Everglades rat snake that is bright red and only lives down in Florida is the same species as the one we have here. They're just different subspecies. But that also means anyone with the pet Everglades rat snake in West Virginia is breaking the law now because of this revision that they made, even though they do not look like that in the wild there. Something similar happened, not regarding the hobby, but with the northern anaconda, when people wrote that article 2 years ago about how they're a distinct species from the green anaconda. And like several other people wrote articles that were published in scientific journals saying that they were not doing a science correctly. And I don't have cut and dry answers for these. I haven't sequenced the DNA myself, but I'm just saying it's things that I think about. It's just stuff I wanted to bring to light. So what can we do to help each other, to help the animals? We can cooperate with each other, communicate, identify our common goals, and keep an open mind. I think professional organizations like this one are great. There's a Mid-Atlantic Turtle and Tortoise Society here. United States Association of Reptile Keepers, USARK, is great. And they help with the legislation as well of making people allowed to keep certain species in areas where they're trying to outlaw them, like tegus in Chicago. I don't think they're going to become invasive there, or in Illinois. But one of the things I do want to emphasize is that nobody knows everything. Nobody knows everything about anything, and definitely not about reptiles and amphibians. And if people try to say that like they're an expert, they're probably not. I'm obviously not an expert, but I just want to share what I do know. And one of the things is dollars talk. And that's the thing that frustrates me at times when I go to these reptile shows and I see money being handed back and forth, and it's all surrounding reptiles and amphibians. I say reptiles more because they are more common in captivity than amphibians, but very little of this money is going to conservation efforts. And I'm guilty of that too. And that's a change I want to make, but it's not just like small everyday breeders. This is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. There are these companies that make caging that, I don't know if you knew this, but like PetSmart and Petco, almost all of their animals come from one conglomerate breeder. None of these people, as far as I am aware of, are doing anything to save animals in the wild. But what I think we could all do more of is spend more time in the woods. And then, so I've mentioned captive breeding several times. Why is that important? Why is it good? So one of the big things here is head starting. Head starting means that you raise an animal up to where it's out of the fragile, young, food for everything stage, and then release it. And I know this has been done with the diamondback terrapins, and it's been successful. And the process of doing that is what repatriation is. It's part of what the zoo is doing with the harlequin toads, but one of the things that they're encountering is they're releasing them back into the wild in Panama, and they're succumbing to chytrid fungus very quickly once again. So it still isn't, it's not solved, it's not figured out. But this is one of the things that captive breeding can do. And it can reduce pressure on the wild populations. Like, for example, something like sunbeam snakes. They're commonly imported, but they're rarely bred in captivity. Now, they're imported legally, they're documented, it's not poaching, but thousands of them come in and people aren't captive breeding them. That's just one example. I could name 20 right now. Like, those wild populations at some point are going to suffer if people continue to take them out of the wild. And if people just breed them in captivity, there will be healthier animals because they haven't been exposed to the elements, put in a bag, flown across the world, thrown in a facility where they may or may not have had good care in the meantime. And it just is important. And there is a reality that some animals are going to go extinct in the wild. And if we don't have them in captivity, they'll be gone forever. One of the things like this, it's not quite what happened, but like crested geckos were believed to be extinct for a long period of time. And then people found them, and now they're one of the most common pet reptiles. I mean, they didn't become, their population wasn't driven down due to collecting and that kind of stuff, as far as I know. But it's just an example of, the fact that something that we believed was no longer on this planet is abundant in captivity now. And together, there already have been a lot of improvements in technology. So caging is a big one. These cages are really nice. I couldn't afford them, but it's just to show that you could purchase them and just throw in the plants. And, when I was growing up, people would just take any animal and put it in a fish tank. And sometimes I talk to people and they think that's still the best way to do it. And it's not. It works for some animals, but it doesn't work for everything. And the fact that we have that, and then you could use the cage and then, use a thermostat on it. You can see here, this is a Herp stat. I have one, I love them. They are pricey, but you can see one on the top of each of these, and they'll control the heat of the heat tape or the heat panel or a heat mat and prevent it from getting too hot. So if you want to get it set to 85 degrees, it can tell you once if it gets too hot and send an alert to your phone, but it'll get to the heat and then stop. So it's not being supplied with power anymore. And then nutrition. For things like dart frogs, now you can just buy commercial vitamins to dust your fruit flies in. That didn't always exist. I don't know what people did before. I tried to look at it and couldn't find much that worked, but instead of whatever people did, crushed up oyster shells for calcium and using chicken thermostats, now we have these products that can be used. Lights are another huge one. I will say, I do believe that some of these companies have financial incentive to bring the science into it in a way that helps them to sell products. So I think it's important that you do your research and due diligence, but the bottom line is some of these products do exist and are very helpful with taking care of animals and can allow you to do it better. The biggest, I think the biggest realistically change of all is the ability of sharing information on the internet. But that definitely is a double-edged sword. Social media. It can help get a message out to people more. It can spread good information, but it can spread misinformation. And a lot of it is shock value. So much of YouTube or Instagram reels are people with these unhealthy, obese snakes that are getting struck by them. There's nothing that helps conservation or hobbyists about it. It's just that people free handling venomous snakes. Who does that help except the individual's ego? Like, there, in the past few months, there has been legislation written in the US because of people free handling venomous snakes on social media, getting bitten, going on dialysis, coming out, and they're still just playing with a cobra because it strokes their ego. And, you know, I think that's absurd. And Facebook groups can be great if they're moderated well, but they can be terrible. People will have a hive mind. I'm working on upgrading caging for a lot of my animals, and I'm looking at it, and I have a Vietnamese blue beauty I brought with me. I'll show you guys. If you don't know, it's an Asian rat snake, basically. They get big, but people are all saying the minimum caging for that is 9 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. I disagree. I think they need a lot of room, but that's to say that that's the minimum it's ridiculous. But someone with some level of authority and the Dunning-Kruger effect will spread like wildfire this misinformation. And, you know, you just got to use your best judgment. So yeah, time to argue. So, I mean, here's just a few hot topics that people talk about, like DIY veterinary care. And that's something that's tough because I've been to reptile vets that I didn't think were very good. They spent like no time with my animals, and people say they're the best one in the region. And I know other people who have gone to the same vet and felt similar. If you need a vet in this area, I do recommend Scott Stahl or Sieves down in Northern Virginia. Just my opinion, but they wrote a book. They're great. Nevertheless, a lot of people will do their own vet care. And that could be suturing a wound. A lot of times it's dealing with an egg-bound snake and things like that. But, you know, do you really want to spend hundreds of dollars to take your animal to a vet who is going to be afraid of it? And I don't, but, you know, it's just something to think about. But one thing that I do think is fascinating that is more recent is using Frontline, actually, some of the treatments that they use for dogs and cats for ticks and fleas has been proven to work for snake mites off label. And you'd have to research the dosage and have a vet like help figure it out with you. But I think that's a really neat idea because especially certain things, like me, I keep a lot of invertebrates, tarantulas. They would die if I use permethrin, the general spray, prevent a mite. And like hognose snakes, for example, will develop a neurological disorder if they're exposed to permethrin. Snake racks, like this pictured here, they can be a great way to house snakes, but they're not everything. It's not perfect. People keep snakes that are too big in them, and it creates problems. But if you take a small baby snake and you throw it in a 40-gallon vivarium, it's probably not going to eat. It's going to be terrified. It's going to feel exposed. And it's very common that like people do that because there's the mentality that bigger is better. But with the rack, you can provide heat on a thermostat, and you can regulate the heat and the humidity and put hides and a place to dig and water bowls and give the snakes what they need. But I also do know that people will keep, you know, large adult female boas in a rack that's, you know, 34 inches long. And that's not right either. And substrate is another one people will argue about forever. There's a variety of kinds that all have their pluses and minuses. UV light. Some people say every reptile should need it. But if you have like an albino snake and you put UV light on it, what's going to happen? It'll damage the eyes. It'll cause sunburn. It really depends on what the animal is. It depends on how strong the UV light is. There's just no end all be all one answer for everything. And that's why more than anything else, I want to emphasize getting information from a variety of sources and using your own logic and intuition. Now, by generational divide, what I'm talking about is I think that there were a lot of people that are older or been into reptiles for longer that spend more time going outside and catching garter snakes and seeing how they live in the wild. Now, some people do treat this like it's a pyramid scheme, and it drives me nuts. Like it's always about what's the next morph, or if I buy this, then I can make this, then I can make this money, and I can afford that. And it's just, it never ends. And it doesn't help the animals in captivity or in the wild. And then one thing, I don't think it's as like hot of a topic, but more first locality. I like both, especially with boas. A lot of the locality animals that I'm interested in come from islands in the Caribbean, off the coast of Central and South America, and they're never going to be imported into the US again. Now, these were isolated animals, so the inbreeding depression has already worked its way out. So there are strong genetics in them. And the animals that exist in the US are finite. You'll never, see them again coming in. If you were lucky enough to see one in the wild, like that, will be incredible. But a lot of these areas are protected as well. But there's that versus morphs, which is, like ball pythons have 300 morphs at least that we know about. But then there's like Volta ball pythons, which get 6 or 7 feet long. They look like a blood python. They'll be like this thick around. And that's just a ball python. But a lot of people don't even know that that locality exists. The kind of, for risk of saying a pun, like the king of locality animals is the alterna, the king snake from the American Southwest. People will say it's a different locality if it's from the other side of the street. But keeping records of that's important. So some good sources of info. Books, there's a ton of them. A lot are great. That means someone actually put in the effort to learn about this and write it down. It takes a lot more effort to do that than it does to copy and paste something from Reddit to Facebook. But not everything is great. Like I said, multiple sources. Scientific literature, I do acknowledge a problem with that is it can be difficult to read a lot of these papers if you haven't done it. But I really will say, as someone who had never done it, had to read dozens a week, it gets easier. And a lot of them are behind a paywall, which is frustrating. But one thing is, if you spend some time looking online, you can find the papers for free. But if you reach out to an author of a lot of these scientific papers, I'm specifically referring to like peer-reviewed papers, a lot of times they'll send you the article for free. Most of the time people want you to read it. They're interested in what they wrote about. And like I keep saying, multiple sources of info, and ask experienced keepers. Someone who's been doing this for 30 years can tell you something that you could be digging through 6 different books to do and then to learn about. And what temperature do you like, what temperature do you incubate these eggs at? Maybe it's in one book, and people in a Facebook group are going to tell you 20 different things, or 20 are going to tell you the same wrong thing. But someone who has been doing it can just answer the question. And if we're just looking online, I'm a fan of forums. I mean, there's like kingsnake.com. It's outdated, but there's still a ton of good info on there. I think you might have to use the Internet Archives, but I've still found good stuff on there. I mean, ballpython.net. There's like dendro boards for dart frogs. There's wealths of information out there. And people, could really get a lot out of it. It takes a little more effort than looking, on a Facebook group or YouTubing, what size boa cage do I need? And some of that is good. Some content creators or some people who make these videos are good. I'm not saying they're all bad, but I'm just saying don't trust anyone completely. And if someone is just half their videos of them getting bit by stuff, that's probably not who you want to learn from. All right, so thank you for your time. Do we have any questions?
That's great. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you.